The next 60 years will be ones of huge disparities between the parts of the world where the population is already in decline and where population growth continues. Only after this period is population then likely to plateau, probably around 2070. So these marked differences will create great tensions because much of the growth is where there's little governmental accountability to those they govern, with corruption, inequalities, lack of health development, and often inadequate education, infrastructure, or even available resources. Yet it's in those areas with the greatest development and freedoms than where the population is actually in decline. So the poorer surplus populations then will have a choice, either to fight and grab a share of the power or to migrate elsewhere and earn it. When we look at the population figures for 2000 to 2050, we see both decline and stabilization. The population decline is most marked in Eastern Europe and Russia due to poor living conditions, social alcoholism, health problems, or in Southern Africa, which is caused by death toll from AIDS or inadequate or lack of good water. We also see it in the Caribbean, largely due to overpopulation and also occurrences of AIDS there. We see in other areas stabilization, and the reasons for this sometimes isn't so good either. So, for example, in China, we see stabilization being caused by the one-child policy and increased urbanization and wealth. We see it in much of Western Europe due to, again, the massive reduction in birth rate, which is actually far below replacement levels. And we see that it's really after 2070 that the world's population will have mainly either declined or stabilized. When we think about population change during this time, we see that the growth is most prominent in certain countries, the Middle East, Yemen, Somalia, and South Central Asia. And that's mostly through a high Muslim birth rate. We see it in Central and West Africa, which will have a long-lasting population expansion. We see it in Latin America with a fairly significant slowing of that growth, but we also see it then in North America, Northern Europe, and Australia, but that is mostly through immigration. When we look at annual growth rates by continent in 2000, we see that the disparities between the continents is actually quite marked, with Africa being by far in the lead here. If we look at world population pyramids for 2000, 2025, and 2050, they again show unequal growth rates of the developing world and the developed world. And so the United Nations defines these as the following. The more developed regions comprise all regions of Europe and North America, Japan. We see the less developed regions comprising Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the least developed countries include about 50 countries, including Afghanistan, Angola, Burkina Faso, the Democratic Republic of Laos, all of these. And so if we look at some charts here, then we can see the less developed moving on to the more developed, and we can compare these across time from 2000 to 2025 and 2050. So the arrows give a key to progress of children born through the quintiles as they get older. The slowing increase in the number of children born here is actually quite discernible. Even in the developing world, this is likely to stabilize in, say, around 2020 to 2030, during that decade, but the population growth rate will continue in a time lag then after that for another 50 years or so. So we get a picture here of the population trends. The growth in population in Africa, Asia, Latin America will increase the already high rate of immigration into the cities. So the changeover year here was for 2007. We see that marked there in red, when the urban population exceeded that of the rural, and we became the first ever urban majority world at that point. So we see the trend towards urbanization here. This slide compares the age pyramids of the 6 continents for both 2000 and 2050. The left hand gives the age pyramids for 2000 in quintiles, the population actually within each 5-year age group, and the youngest is at the bottom. So the right hand gives the same statistics projected then for 2050. So we can see here that by 2000, Europe's population had relatively few young people. The Pacific was stagnant, and then Africa and Asia were very youthful. And then by 2050, we can see that the only continent with continued massive growth and youthfulness will be in Africa. And Asia will have then joined all the other continents in having a declining number of young people. And by 2050, the African and Asian populations will be quite significant as we move ahead. So one of the key emphases in ministry globally then will be how do we disciple youth in Asia and especially in Africa. Africa will be the only continent in the world in which young people will be increasing in 2050, though the birth rate will be slowing. So the arrow shows the progression of youngest group from 2000 to 2050. This slide compares the different continents and their respective growths from 1900 to 2050. Notice the big disparities in both sizes of population and in their differing growth spurts. So in 1900, Europe's population was 25%, that of the world, and those European origin dominated 95% of the world's landmass and had a lot of the industrial power in the world. In 1900, Europe and Asia together comprised 84% of the world's total population, and the Pacific, Latin America, and Africa at that point comprised just 14% of the world's population. By the time we get to 1950s to 2000, the growth spurt for Asia and Latin America came in the latter part of the 20th century, but they're slowing as we get into the early part of the 21st century. As we look at the 2000 to 2050 time frame, we see that the main growth spurt will be in Africa, wherever AIDS, of course, doesn't decimate populations as it has in the southern and the central regions. Growth will also continue in many of the poorest Muslim countries of Asia, such as Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Yemen. So the future is bleak without radical change, with the emergence of accountable, responsible, non-corrupt governments, and also the development of education and infrastructure in their economies. By 2050, then, Europe population will have dropped to a mere 7%. The West will be 12.6% of the world's population. So the globalization of industry, trade, telecommunications, political power will continue to erode actually the West's ability to influence the future direction of the world. This shows world population growth patterns to 2050, demonstrating that the world population explosion will radically slow. The more developed world population peaked with the post-World War II baby boom in around 1960, and the less developed world will probably peak around 2040 or 2070 if present patterns continue. There are no major demographic shocks or anything like that. So a helpful way of seeing this is plotting the population estimates for two population groups, a generation apart, and in this case, young children up to 4 and adults ages 25 to 29 were considered. So when we look at the more developed world, we see that as the armies demobilized, refugees returned home, and economies began to function again, and there was a high birth spurt, which we often call baby boom. When we look at the boomers, then those born in that time are called the boomers. They have greater wealth, education. We do see a breakdown of families and easy availability of methods of contraception, then also lowered birth rates, so that by 2000, nearly all developed countries were actually then starting to decline in numbers. Only those with high immigration from the less developed world were actually able to maintain their numbers. So it's estimated that by 2050, there will be population stability, but the effects of higher numbers of old people who need care and support is going to be a potential challenge for the 21st century. If we move on to look at the less developed world, the population explosion, the fall of World War II, and the ending of colonial empires was generated by massive industrialization, urbanization, widespread improvements in food availability, cleaner water, healthcare, even literacy. All of this led to longer lifespans. So efforts to constrain this explosion have varied from one-child policy in China, rather to involuntary limitation through AIDS in Africa. Population explosion will be more long-lasting in the Muslim world, where education and economic development is the slowest, and poverty is likely to increase the most there, and in many areas the water supplies are quite inadequate. So this, combined with Islamicist militancy, could make the Muslim world the most potent demographic time bomb for the next 2 or 3 generations. Fourthly, if we go on and think about birth and population peaking, there's likely to be a birth peak at around 2050, but the growth in the global population will continue to at least 2040. After that, there will be an end to population expansion, possibly. The huge growth in the less developed world will put huge pressures for legal and illegal migration on developed parts of the world for the coming 60 years or so, with really unknown social and demographic implications, especially in that a high proportion of the migrants will be Muslims who then are less likely to assimilate into local populations. The implications of these demographic changes are immense, both for the wider world and also for the Christian church. We can take some comfort from the likelihood that the world population will stabilize later this century, but in the meantime, the countries with the greatest growth rates are the ones that are actually the least able to sustain the burden of that increase. The resulting impoverishment and eco-degradation will cause greater poverty, instability, movements of population. The tragedy is that the huge cost of migrating this with appropriate aid is being largely diverted to expensive military defense and against Islamic terrorism, or incremental reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. Also, much of the finance given in projects in less developed countries rarely address actually the root problems and lead to sustainable or reproductive changes. So these are some of the changes that we face. The question emerges: how ought governmental, how should non-government organizations, how should Christian aid organizations, and how should their aid be best administered to achieve the goal that we have. So this graph here shows population growth of the top 20 countries and this significance of which countries will be growing and the demographic implications of this growth. The UN projections of 2002 for the long term give indications as to possible population growth under present trends for each country of the world. This does not include any other factors such as major wars, long-lasting famines, natural disasters, etc. So in 1950, it was predominantly industrialized. Developed countries tended to top the list, but this rapidly changed in the last half of the 20th century as developed country birth rates plummeted and that of the developing world peaked as we get into 1990. So by 2010, the two big countries, India and China, were approaching parity. The developing world began to dominate the list. Only 5 developed countries remained on the list, and the fastest growth was in Muslim regions. So Muslim or African or both areas of population growth will continue to dominate until the mid-21st century. And during the latter part of the 21st century, the great majority of unsustainable, really, population growth will be in the Muslim countries of Africa and Asia. Many of these countries will suffer severe food, water, resource shortages, and their impoverished millions really will be greatly increased, and the flow of economic and other refugees to more developed regions will happen. We'll also see probably a depopulation of Europe during this time. We should also note that massive disasters could both cut growth rates, but also increase refugee rates to such an extent that there will be serious cultural, economic, religious implications for developed societies that threaten democracy, religious freedoms, and economies. There's some potential scenarios would be unexpected, catastrophic climate change, some kind of disease that could be revived, or a current disease that's mutated. Of course, war is always a possibility that could influence our current reality. So the implication here is that even without major surprises, Christians face an enormous challenge from increased migration, which will be predominantly Muslim. A major global catastrophe could require enormous effort from Christians to show the love of Christ, and may be part of the yet unreaped massive harvest. So the innate violence of Islam, its internal contradictions and hatreds, as well as the emerging conflict for power in the Middle East between nuclear-armed, antagonistic Sunni and Shiite Muslims, could create a possible implosion of Islam and actually new opportunities for the gospel. So, as we look ahead, we can see here that there are certainly challenges ahead, but many opportunities, and we pray that Christ return and that we be prepared to face the challenges.